Hello, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for those fantastic introductions. It is a real honor to be invited to chair this discussion. I have been writing about the pavilions of the Venice Biennale for about a decade, and I have to say I have rarely seen pavilions whose themes and whose curatorial teams are so timely and as thoughtful as the three represented on this panel. I think each are exceptional. If you get to go to Venice at any point during the exhibition, please go and have a look at all three of these pavilions. But if you can't get to Venice, dig them out online. It's such an extraordinary richness of research behind all three of them. So root them out. I'm going to introduce our panel. We are joined by three of the curators at the Venice Biennale, the curators of the Pavilion of Finland, the Nordic Pavilion, and the US Pavilion. So that's Philip Tidwell, who is one of the curators of New Standards, which is the Pavilion of Finland, Siv Helena Stangeland of Helene and Hard, who are the curators of the Nordic Pavilion, and Paul Andersen, one of the curators behind the United States Pavilion. Thank you all three of you for joining us. So what's going to happen is we're going to have a short discussion exploring the kind of themes of the three pavilions, how they intersect, how they relate to the question of how we live together, how they relate to timber architecture in general. But first, we're going to ask each of the three curators to very quickly present their pavilion and the themes that it addresses. So let's kick off with our hosts, the Pavilion of Finland. So Philip, please, if you could share your slides and tell us a little bit about the project, that would be fantastic.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Finn. This year at the Pavilion of Finland, we take up the question of how we will live together, not by presenting contemporary works of architecture, but by revisiting a moment in which the question of living together in Finland really became a national crisis, the early 1940s, when in the wake of war, a company was set up by the name of Puutalo, or Timber Houses Ltd, that really changed systems of building in wood throughout the country. And curatorially, we present the history of that company through a timeline, which allows us to present some of the archival information. And we trace its development from a company that was originally producing domestic solutions for housing to exports to the Soviet Union in the wake of the war, to eventually a worldwide exporter of prefabricated wooden buildings that traveled around the world and have a surprising degree of kind of reach and scale. The material that we're presenting is drawn largely from the company archives, which are held here in Finland in the central archives for Finnish business records, as it were. And so it allows us to show things like advertising, production drawings, assembly drawings that were all integral to the way that this company the methods this company pursued. There's far too much information to be shown in a single exhibition, so this is actually complemented or supplemented by an online map which presents these country by country in a bit more detail. The counterpart to that historical narrative is a contemporary look at three particular neighborhoods, which are documented by our photographer, Juuso Westerlund, who has spent the last year traveling around to three locations in Helsinki, Aarhus, and Barranquilla on the northern coast of Colombia, to sort of take a contemporary look at neighborhoods that were built in the 1940s and 50s, and to move inside of these houses and photograph the houses themselves, but also the residents who occupy them.
Fantastic. It's such an extraordinary research project. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's sort of learning about Puutalo for the first time through this and just finding it such a rich topic. And my God, those photographs are amazing on their own, just really stunning stuff. So next, let's hear from Siv Helena, who is one of the founders of the architecture practice Helene and Hard, who are based in Stavanger and also in Oslo in Norway. I guess Helene and Hard are kind of pioneers of timber construction in a number of projects, but also communal living. And it is really the kind of intersection of those two that kind of forms the basis of the Nordic Pavilion this year. So Siv Helena, please can you share your slides and take us through the Nordic Pavilion this year?
Yeah. The installation, What We Share, is the name. It's a vision for a sustainable future model for co-housing, and it's curated by the National Museum in Oslo. So we are the architects, just to correct that a little bit. We started by interviewing 12 residents from an existing co-housing project that we have done to further develop the idea of co-housing. And they were asked what more they could imagine to share if they were to move into a new co-housing project. And based on these answers, we developed a new spatial organization with 3 interrelated zones, and which we built then in full scale in the pavilion, which you see here a plan of. So there is the private domain at each side, and there's a sharing zone just outside the apartment, and there's a central common space in the middle where everyone can meet. The whole installation is made with a self-built system of solid wooden planks and beech dovels, and it's a very flexible, modular, and easy to assemble and disassemble and reuse by the inhabitants. And we build both separation walls and floors and furniture with it. So here you see what we call a sharing zone with the apartments on the left side and the bigger common room in the middle. And you see how the same system is used for separation walls filled with hemp then, and as shelves making up furniture towards the center. Here's another situation where we have showed that you can build the workshops and you can fill up drawers with tools and equipment that you can share with your neighbors. And there is a big table in the middle for the house meetings going on. And of course, it was quite challenging to build in the Pavilion of Sverre, we have to admit. And the key was, in fact, when we found that we could use this shelf system in solid timber as a mediator between this everyday life and the sublime spatial character of this room. Thank you.
No, thank you. I mean, very jealous of being able to make anything in the Nordic Pavilion. What an extraordinary space, and what a great exhibition. Finally, then, we have Paul Andersen, who is one of the curators behind the American Pavilion, US Pavilion. Paul, hand straight over to you. Please, can you share your slides and take us through it?
Yes. First of all, thank you for having me. This has been a rewarding experience already, and we haven't even gotten to the discussion yet. So for our pavilion, we look at a construction system that is the most common way to build in the United States, which is stick-built timber or softwood framing. What you see on screen right now is a small group of people building a house, a farmhouse in Nebraska in the late 18th century. It became popular because it was lightweight and inexpensive and easy to use. You just nail the boards together. So, you know, you didn't need heavy machinery or a lot of people or you know, technical skill to do it. And so people could do it on their own, more or less. And that was important during a time of particularly rapid expansion in the U.S. And but it's still the way that we build today. Over 90% of our houses are wood framed. So our goal is to introduce the topic and maybe begin to speculate on how it might be the basis of some new design or new architecture. So our exhibition has a few parts. The biggest part, I guess, is an addition to the existing U.S. Pavilion that was built across the front of it. It forms a new facade for the neoclassical building that was built by Delano and Aldrich in 1930 and aspires to European architecture and kind of completes the open side of the building's courtyard with this domestic ubiquitous project of the wood framed house. It is a little bit, and people will be able to, or are able to walk around inside of it. It's a 4-story building. You can walk through the first 3 floors. And the goal was to introduce people to the topic of wood framing just through experience. You know, they can see it, they can be in it, they can understand what it is without us having to explain too much. which also then helps us to, you know, when the visitors get to the galleries to see other things. So it's kind of like a normal house. It has a roof, it has dormers, it has a porch and stairs, but all of those things are put together in ways that are somewhat unusual, like either in their proportions, like it's very, very tall and very, very thin, or in their quantities, like the facade is almost all roof. Or like in this case, the composition, some of the dormers are sliced off by the edge of the roof, and so you end up with some quirky, idiosyncratic moments in it as well. Inside the house is furniture by Thomas Kelly and Carrie Norman, some colleagues of ours at University of Illinois Chicago, where my co-curator Paul Preisner and I both teach. And they have built shaker furniture out of dimensional lumber to sort of see how that changes the furniture itself by shifting material. And then inside the galleries, we have 2 series of photographs, one by Chris Strong that looks at construction sites. And in this case, what you see in the background of this image are photos of people who work in and around wood framing in mills, construction sites, undocumented labor. And then we also have a series of models that present the history of wood framing through some different types of projects. Like the one in this image is a warehouse by George Washington Snow, which may have been the first wood framed building. We're not really sure. And that's it. That's
Wow.
what they'll see.
No, thank you so much. Really interesting, and really like even the furniture just looks like such a kind of interesting contribution to the kind of context of the Giardini and all the kind of crazy stuff that happens in that garden. I mean, I'm sure the audience can already get a sense of like how much commonality there is between these pavilions. They're all kind of exploring different things, different ways of working with timber, different traditions, different cultural contexts. But there's clearly lots of points of crossover between these 3 projects. So we don't have an enormous amount of time. So what we'll do is we'll just jump in. I'm going to throw some questions at our 3 pavilion makers, and I think if the audience want to ask questions as well, we may or may not have time, but just like whack them in the chat, and then they'll be conveyed to me, and maybe I can relay them to the panel if we have time. So I mean, for me, it seems like all 3 have a real engagement with this question of authorship. Who is empowered to create a home, the home, and who is empowered to kind of change the home, and really kind of timber forms the answer to that question in different ways across all 3 pavilions. So in the US pavilion, we have this sort of system of standards and techniques that's become so ubiquitous and accessible that in some ways, to me, it represents almost an idea of architecture that is totally democratized, like the kind of absolute realization of a way of building that is quite far away from kind of professional architecture, where almost kind of anyone has the power to make a physical change, to build a home from scratch, to extend a home, to meddle with the kind of the form and the fabric of the house, of the home. And then in the Nordic Pavilion, there's this communal design that has been co-produced between Helene and Hard, professional architects, and the community of the co-housing scheme, who have been invited to kind of co-create this design between them, using this system that Siv Helena talked about, these poles and these mass timber planks, which is a system that is, as I've understood it, to be very accessible. You know, it's not relying on like really heavy duty machinery or sophisticated bits of equipment to be able to make. And then in the Finnish pavilion, you have Puuttalo, this producer of really rather sophisticated mass produced houses, which start off maybe as something with a lot of design intensity going into their kind of creation, but then once they're built, become very adaptable, become very empowering of the residents who live in them, and kind of change over time and mutate and grow and evolve. And so my question, and I'll maybe fire it at you, Philip, and then we can see where we go, is do you see timber as a kind of fundamentally empowering material And who should be the author of our homes? You know, is it something that architects should do, or is it something that citizens should do, or is it a kind of rich mix between those two authors?
I mean, I think it's a very good question, because I think that is at the heart of what each of these three, what some of the shared territory between the three exhibitions. I think it's a question. I mean, I think undeniably, to suggest that architects somehow exist as sole authors is just quite simply a falsehood that persists despite its kind of evident the evident problems. Architecture inevitably is, certainly domestic architecture, is affected by its occupants, either by sort of overtaking, by you know, altering the buildings. And I think in this way, the question of wood is actually quite important because of its manipulability, because in every case that we're presenting here, I mean, the ability, the access to the kind of tools and the kind of abilities to change the homes for themselves, or the buildings for themselves, is something that persists with wood more easily than many other materials. But I guess, you know, what we see maybe is three different modes of when that interaction occurs. In the American example, I think there's a kind of idea of, you're right, a sort of ubiquitous system that is then appropriated by different users. In the Nordic Pavilion, I think you have a much more direct collaboration between an architect working with the users of the building prior to the mode of construction. And in the Finnish example, what I find to be really interesting is that, you know, there's the houses began life as identical in some way. There, you know, what's incredible about like the Columbia example is there were more than 2,500 homes completely identical, stamped out next to one another, but they've taken on a life of their own over time. But at the same time, one of the reasons I think that, you know, projects like the one we're presenting have been overlooked is because they really are a challenging idea of authorship. They've been thought to be, their ubiquity has made them sort of anonymous, but in fact they were designed by architects. They were highly designed because they were they were a system. You know, each puutalo house had a degree of attention that an architect can hardly afford to give to a single house when one is designing it, and yet the sort of ubiquity of them, actually the mass production aspect, is what enabled that. It was a long-winded answer, but I think wood is a key unifier, but it's a unifier not just because of the things we think about, you know, we like wood, it's warm and it's, you know, ecological, but in fact because of this ability of people to sort of take to work on it, to adapt things.
Siv, Helena, it feels like the question of how an architect works with a community for you is not just a sort of professional question, but a personal question, in that you live amongst the people that you've designed the Nordic Pavilion installation with. Where do you stand on the kind of question of authorship? How much should be left to the architect, and where can a citizen contribute without kind of that professional background?
I think it's a very complex question, and I think maybe at the heart of it, I would say that timber at least gives the possibility for us to find very rich and more dynamic and interesting relationship between residents and the professionals. So, and I think we also have to look at it more fine-tuned in terms of what is happening in the design stages, what is happening in the building stages, and what is happening after residents are taking over and living there. So there is a lot of there's a time span, and there is a lot of different I think changes in and important interactions between architects and residents. As I see it, it's not that we are needed, that's for sure. So even though I would love people to take over, I see that, for example, building a communal house in an urban area, 5, 6, 7 stories high, it's complex. So you need clever plan layouts, you need efficiency when it comes to making things compact and not using space in a stupid way. There is a lot of, and then it comes also to, I think our task is basically to provide people with tools so they can both be able to interact and also influence the design in the early design stages, as well as when it comes to changing your flat afterwards if you need that. So, and then a building system in timber is of course a very important part of that. But I would say that I think it's much more a complex and interesting relationship we have between us, especially when it comes to co-housing, where the participatory processes are so kind of intermingled and going in parallel with the whole development of the project.
Well, I'm going to come to you in a moment on this, but I wanted to kind of bolt in a thought about technology before I do, if that's okay. So yeah. It feels like technology is a really interesting thread here as well, because all three pavilions are using construction technology. Like that's a kind of bit part of the focus. And I guess for a lot of us, when we think of the word technology, we think of kind of, science fiction, steel and glass aesthetics, Elon Musk traveling to Mars in a Tesla with his Bitcoin in his pocket or whatever, all these kind of space age cliches. We don't think of wood, right? We don't think of wood as a pioneering technological solution so much, but in many ways, the kind of the technology that is at the heart of all three of your pavilions is, or certainly was when it was kind of brought to the market, kind of cutting edge, and still is in many ways, but cutting edge in a kind of more humble, more day-to-day, more accessible way than the kind of Elon Musk cliche. And it's striking to me that the same material, wood, I think specifically softwood, has found three distinct technological expressions. And so my question for you, Paul, is, how do you think the timber system here is expressive of the culture in which it is being used, or from which it has come? Is the Puuttalo system somehow expressive of Finnish culture? And for you, is the kind of the American frame somehow, is that part of the American dream? Does that kind of chime with the kind of the land of the free, or is there a kind of Americanness that you see in the kind of the use of the timber frame across the country?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, for sure. I think one way that there is a kind of Americanness to it is that it's pretty inexpensive material, and that there aren't different grades that have different prices or values. So it doesn't matter how much money you have. You can't buy a better 2x4 than your neighbor. It's just like everybody gets the same stuff, and they build, whatever they want or need out of that. So I think that that is egalitarian in a way that opens it up so that people could really, that sort of democratic idea that if everybody is like the same and equal, that frees people to individually express themselves to some extent. And I think that that's pretty much true, actually. It's also, there are more deeper embedded, I think, connections to the culture. Like, it is so easy to change, and it is lightweight and thin and seems kind of inconsequential. So that I believe that, I don't know whether this is an expression of the culture or it's something that it influenced the culture, but I do think that that there's a relationship, between that and some artistic practices and creative practices in the U.S. over the years, which have been, kind of bored with tradition, resistant to authority, maybe, rough and improvisational. But that part is sort of American, but it's also sort of not. I mean, what I'm describing there is actually in all three of these projects, and that's what I was finding interesting in the earlier responses, is that, it's not really an either-or proposition in the end. It's not like full control of an architect or full control of people who aren't architects. It's somehow both, but both in different ways, for sure. And I think that Siv and Philip have presented those things very eloquently. In the U.S., it seems to me like it's not. There's another thing, which is there's parallel tracks. Like, there are architects who are building stuff in wood framing, and they're doing experimental work in architecture or not. And there are people who are sort of building stuff themselves, and it's okay that everybody's has different interests and tastes and ambitions for it, and that seems to work. And I think, so it's, I just, our contribution could be misunderstood as like, oh, we see this thing that like, kind of everybody uses, but we want to like really take control of it now. I don't really think that would be so good, and it also would be impossible. And but I think it's also another interesting model for how you can have participation in different ways simultaneously.
Yeah, I mean, I was
gonna throw it back to you anyway, Philip. Partly to
I was just.
Sorry, I veered off the technology, so maybe
No, I think the question is, I think you're on to something, Paul, which is, and I think the question of culture, the relationship between culture and technology is really pertinent in these three examples, because certainly, I mean, and I think it takes a kind of expansion of our notion of culture. I mean, when I say culture, I mean very broadly, not a kind of stereotype of Finnish culture, but the particularities of what, let's say, in the example of why this particular form of construction proliferated in the 1940s and 50s. I mean, it's a product of a labor shortage brought about by massive devastation of war that said, we can't. The model of everyone sort of, dumping a bunch of timber on site, building your house with your hands and saws wasn't very effective. And so that factored in. There's a climatic condition that factored in. Part of the reason the timber frame, the balloon frame, didn't proliferate in Finland was it requires a degree. It doesn't provide the same degree of insulation. So that mattered. And then also, I think the sort of, the efficacies of construction, the availability of material. Finland has never had a shortage of timber. So the idea of conservation, which some of the kind of efficiencies of the timber frame were not so relevant in the Finnish context. And I think why that's interesting is because those relationships persist today, right? So the proliferation of CLT construction or mass timber construction today is a kind of extension of some of the conditions that emerged out of the post-war period in Europe, which is to say a shortage of labor, an ambition to manufacture things in a factory and put them up on site. The difference now is we're able to sort of use more infrastructure on building sites, so cranes to lift things to make larger. We've seen a shift in the sort of building technology. But those technologies are absolutely kind of a product of cultural, economic conditions that arise at a particular moment. I mean, culture ultimately does have a great deal to do with the sort of specific, cauldron out of which it is cast. So I think I think there's a lot to that, and I see that certainly. I don't know, Siv I might turn it to Siv, but I think to this sort of contemporary sort of, we're dealing with the. You're absolutely right, Finn, that, I mean, we're all dealing with the same raw material, which is to say softwoods that are not, known for their, I mean, they have limited structural capacity, and we're looking at different ways of putting them together. And today, the one of which has become kind of most fashionable in the European context, and I say that advisedly because I think there's some important, the one that is becoming more viable is mass timber. But the reasons for that and the way in which we use it are also something that we should sort of not see outside of the lens of culture.
If we could go with that of moving to Siv Helene again, because I understand that you've kind of criticized in the past the use of glue laminated timber or of cross laminated timber for particular reasons. For those in the audience who aren't sort of super timber nerds, these are all different kinds of ways that you can create construction materials out of wood. But I was wondering if, Siv Helene, you could kind of talk us through your take on which of these technologies or these ways of using timber are your favorite and why.
Yes. I mean, it's not that we are against CLT or these mass-produced bigger timber elements that, of course, are very efficient when it comes to putting up huge structures with timber. And that's why they got so, I guess, popular. But they are also very heavy, and you need cranes, and logistics of them is quite tough on the building plot. So I think we should also kind of be aware of when that is the right answer. It's also very it consumes a lot of timber. So it's not these ones I think, friendly way to build with timber. You can build a lightweight walls, prefabricated, and use timber where you really need to use timber. So we also have to think about how we use the resources we have, because forests are also something that we have to care about. And then on the other hand, I think there is something we can kind of jump over, which is exactly what we all three point at, the possibility of using solid wood, which is not glued and it's coming directly from the sawmill, and you can use locally produced planks from a sawmill, which is also a sustainable way of supporting a local production. And then what we wanted to show, and also the other two examples here shows, is that you can do so much with that simple plank in terms of geometry, form, shapes, and structures. So I think it's very to the point to say that we need to have a great variations of to show the different and great variations we have when we build with timber.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's just stick with sustainability for a moment, because it is one of the things I'm so excited about seeing these three pavilions all engaging with timber, is because timber is such an important part of how we will all need to build in the future to kind of get through the climate emergency, right? Now, it's a big if, but if forests are responsibly managed, and if timber is responsibly seasoned, then timber can be not only a kind of low carbon construction material, but a carbon sequesterer, which means that it kind of sucks carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and stores it in a safe way. So, you know, if around the world we can find kind of creative and responsible ways to build with timber, that could be a really important part of how the built environment, the architecture sector, responds to the climate emergency. And yet, if I've kind of understood maybe Paul's presentation properly, for the kind of maybe the bigger, more famous architects don't seem to use timber so much. They're still, you know, largely using concrete, steel, brick, these kind of very high carbon, very highly produced materials with enormous ecological footprints. And it sort of feels to me, at least, like some architects maybe look down on timber and look down on frame construction, even look down on mass timber and CLT, as if it was somehow lesser, like a less prestigious or less substantial material to build with. And so I wondered, and maybe Paul, you can jump in on this question, you know, why does timber not always get the kind of the status that it maybe should be deserved? You know, we're talking about a super material that can help us get out of the climate emergency, but it's not always seen like that by all designers. So what do you think those kind of like star architects could or should be learning from kind of more humble American framing or timber construction systems in general?
I mean, I don't know that it has like an inferior status in the field. I would say it just kind of doesn't have a status. It's more like something that's just not discussed. And I think there are plenty of really beautiful projects done by very talented architects that are building in, you know, in the United States for sure, and Canada. There are, you know, a lot of really, really great projects that are wood framed. You don't see that part of it because it's always covered. You know, the framing is an internal structure that you never see, so you might not be aware of it, but it's there, and they've used it. It just hasn't been part of the discussion. So I think, you know, it could be, and you know, and why not? Because I think there are a bunch of benefits that could come from just paying a little bit more attention to it. Some of which are environmental, some of which are cultural, some of which are disciplinary, and you know, and have to do with how we think and work as architects. So, yeah, I mean, that would be my quick response, is that it's yeah, we're trying to elevate it, but like not out of the gutter, you know, like it's not like it's just, we're just trying to kind of like begin talking about it and thinking about it and seeing, you know, what some of the benefits of that might be.
No, absolutely. Okay, so we have not got a huge amount of time left. We have a comment from someone called Petri. Hi, Petri. Thanks for joining us. who says, wood is a democratic material. I totally agree. I think that's kind of, there is something slightly democratic about the way that you can cut it, the way it's lighter weight than some of these materials. And we have a question from Mariana who asks, can timber standardization become a wider global model for the future? Maybe this, I might be reading into this, but potentially this is a question looking at, you know, not all parts of the world are Northern Hemisphere, highly forested, like the US or the Nordic region. Maybe this is one for Paul, as for Philip, as the kind of Puuttalo houses were exported all over the world. What kind of role can timber architecture play in places which aren't kind of blessed with enormous forests to start with?
Well, I mean, okay, let's start. One, there is no such thing as a kind of, you know, there's nothing sustainable about wood architecture if it's not connected to a sustainable forestry practice. So that's kind of square one to begin with. I mean, we have to be like, that is a central kind of component of any argument for the sustainability or the kind of ecological efficiency of wood construction. So that's a critical point. But I think one of the things that we put forward with the exhibition is that things like the kind of houses that were presented, partly they're very modest. They're also the kind of idea that standardization and repetition lead inherently to banality, to a kind of to an aesthetic condition that sort of we think we know, is something that I think we should push back a bit on. I think that you know, the idea, one of the things that is evident in the Puuttalo houses is that, similar as they were, or same as many of them were, that there's a dramatic degree of variation, not only in the way that they changed, but in the way that they sort of landed in various places around the world, the kind of ways that they were put together to form neighborhoods and different kinds of buildings. They're basically based on a very similar set of parts, but they produce a massive level of differentiation. I think that kind of thinking in the contemporary environment is incredibly necessary if we're going to attack things at a scale that really has effects. When we talk about the relationship between architecture and climate change, it's not going to come through, you know, saving Miami from rising seas is not going to come from building enough public buildings with good, you know, insulation. It's just not. We have to think kind of about how we start to integrate and reform and change building systems at a much larger scale. And I think that's what's quite exciting about looking at the sort of systems that underlie modes of construction that have perhaps passed out of architecture, the balloon frame, the paneled house. I would say that, you know, Helene, your practice, not just what you're presenting here in the pavilion, but I think your practice really is kind of on the front edge of seeing how we start to take, you know, perhaps standardize, but we take apply these materials in ways that matter. And it's not just about kind of single one-off buildings, but how they might be repeatable solutions that kind of work at an urban scale to really change the way we build, not just to kind of inform individual buildings.
Yes, just adding to that, changing how we build, but I think it's a clue that we have to change the way we think when we draw architecture, because timber, you have to think in timber if you're going to make a building that is a timber building in the end. You have to understand what you're drawing, and that's a quite big shift, which many architects maybe doesn't get.
I think the role of abstraction in architecture has been so profound that it has also, and it has been profoundly enabling, but it has also in some level kind of impoverished us with regard to material understanding. I think it's not surprising that when one designs purely from a point of view of, with a conception of form, that in the end what one designs is not exactly easily realizable in something like wood. So to get back to your kind of accusation, Finn, I think it's not a surprise that, you know, you end up building something in steel framing if you haven't really thought about how it might be assembled. But that speaks to a sort of need, I think, for architects to have a less sort of impoverished relationship to material thinking.
Absolutely. One of the things I really admire about Nordic architectural education is that it is much more rooted in the question of how you build and tectonics and thinking through materials, not just this kind of like what we maybe get in Britain and America sometimes of sort of designing with just pure form, like this sort of magical material of just stuff that has no kind of technological root to it. I want to ask a final question that's not so much about timber, it's more about the home and how we live together, which of course is the theme of the Biennale as a whole. Because of course that's the other thing that connects all of these projects is they're rooted in domestic life. And Puutalo, of course, mass-produced homes of a particular set of sizes and standards with variation. But then the Nordic Pavilion really challenges the whole conception of the kind of single-family home as an idea and presents something kind of potentially far more kind of radical or challenging about what a home could or should be. So my question is sort of like, well, if Puutalo was to start mass-producing homes today, what would they be like? Would they be single-family homes, or would they be more like the kind of Helene and Hard communal home, or would there be a kind of total mix? Maybe we could have Helene with a sort of 1 minute answer, and then Philip.
I think the idea of home is changing very much. We are becoming much more aware of that we are interconnected, interdependent, and I think also there is a new interest in communal life and how much the social wealth is in fact important more than the material wealth. Or one could say, if maybe better to say that the material wealth is much more linked up to the sustainability and the health aspect of it. So all this has to do with how we define our homes in the end, and redefine them, I think, at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's to directly answer your question, Finn, I think that's a project that I want to take on, and I hope architects begin to take on. What is the Puutalo house of the climate change generation? It would be a mistake, and I do want to if anyone had the impression that in presenting the work that we're presenting at the Pavilion, that we thought the solution to the next generation of architectural invention was to go back to the single family home or to reintroduce the Puutalo model. It necessarily has to be different in the way that we approach the problem today. But I think there are some fundamental things that that still persist. The idea of a kind of being able to take ownership of the space in which you live, but also the communality, I think is really important. One of the things that's really come through in the photographic project is the way that, as looking at any one individual house is not that interesting, but looking at neighborhoods, the neighborhoods that we've documented in detail, really, there's an incredible social life to them that exists in the spaces between, in the backyards, in the streets, in the courtyards and alleyways of these neighborhoods that I think we have to think today with a greater degree of density. The sort of single family house solution that you see in these buildings is not, I think, the answer to our contemporary problems, but it's certainly, I think, a moment, something to reflect back on is how we might do something like this that operates at scale. What is the Puutalo home of the future is a kind of question I've been thinking about and sketching about, and will be sketching on for the next decade, I'm sure.
Next Biennale, maybe in 2 years' time, we can come back and answer that question. I've been given very strict instructions to finish at past on the dot, so I'm afraid we have to cut it off there. Thank you so much, Philip, Paul and Helene, for joining us. On behalf of Archinfo Finland and the New Standards curators, thank you all for participating in this inauguration event. I guess the Finnish Pavilion is now officially open. So if you are in Venice, go and have a look. If you're not in Venice, get on the website. A recording of this whole thing is going to be available on the platform right after the event. So if you joined us late, you can catch the start of that. And it will soon also be published on newstandards.info. Thank you very much and see you all soon. Take care. Bye.
Thank you so much.